So this video begins a new unit as part of some of the additional functionality associated with Excel. These functions that we'll learn in here, which most people call conditional functions or lookup functions, these are extremely helpful when digesting large amounts of data, particularly in a financial setting. If you have, let's say, a sales log or you have some sort of inventory, these conditional lookup functions will allow you to quickly summarize that data, especially if it's in a very sort of systematically set up way. And so it lets you digest a lot of information quickly. So this first video will just kind of introduce you with some of the conditional functions. Then we'll do a separate video how we actually utilize them within some Excel spreadsheets, and then we'll do lookup functions in further videos along from there. So let's just go on and get started here. If I could get these slides to progress. There we go. So a conditional function is really any kind of function that is based upon some sort of logical test. It's based upon, as it states here, true or false conditions. And so remember that Excel stores data in several different types. You have logical data, that would be true or false. You have text data, you have numerical data. So the logical test is any kind of equation or any kind of formula that uses a logical operator that's going to return or true or false function. So for example, the less than sign, you have 5 is less than 7. That is true, right? So if you were to utilize that conditional test with that logical test, your function would return true. And so these are false statements on this side of the spectrum. If you did the equal sign, right, you see that 5 equals 5, that's true. 5 equals 3 or 5 equals 7, that's obviously false. And then we have some more complex logical operators like less than or greater than or equal to, or not equal to. That's always a good one to utilize. And so, but all of these show you the sort of basic syntax for how you would utilize some logical operators. That may not make a lot of sense, right? It would be very easy for someone to determine whether or not 5 is greater than 7 or 5 is equal to 5. That sounds kind of silly that we're talking about this. We'll realize that conditional functions return some sort of desired result based upon the outcome of a logical test. So for example, if I am looking at some data and I want to say, oh, I want to see the months of the year or the days of the year or the quarters of the year where sales were greater than some specified number, 250,000. That's when you'd utilize a conditional function, because you set up a logical test and then you state that you want to utilize a conditional function that's only going to return values if that logical test is true. And so that kind of function is often called an if function. So you see the syntax here on this first line. The if function has 3 distinct arguments to it. The first is the logical test. The second argument is the value if that logical test is true. And then the third argument is the value if that logical test is false. So one thing you might do is you might want to say, okay, if cell C5 is less than 0, so Excel is going to look at C5 and it's going to say, is that number there greater than or equal to 0? Your condition that you're saying is it less than 0? Well, if that's true, then what the formula will return is the phrase negative number if C5 is less than 0, which we know that's true, or positive number if C5 is not less than 0, meaning it's positive. So this is a simple if statement that if programmed into a cell, it's going to reference some cell, C5, it's going to perform a logical test on it, and if that logical test is true, meaning C5 is less than 0, then this formula is going to return the phrase negative number, which would be accurate, correct? But if it's not less than 0, it's going to return positive number, right? Now, that is sort of the basic mechanics of an if statement, but you may want to be thinking to yourself, well, what if it is equal to 0? How do we handle that? Whoops. Well, that we're going to cover here in just a second, so just hang on to that thought. You can also use if functions in a variety of different ways. So here's a more complex one here in this third bullet point. So what we're doing now is we're actually naming a range of cells, and we'll get practice with this on the worksheet for this particular module. We're going to call a range of cells sales, whatever that is, and the if statement, right? We start the if statement. The first argument, which is right here, is the actual logical test, and the logical test is the sum of sales. So if we add all the sales up in a specific range, is greater than what we've also named the target, whatever that is. If that's true, then you see a 0.3 is returned. And if that's not true, if it's false, then a no bonus is returned. So this is kind of like setting up how you solicit bonuses for different salesmen, right? If their sales are greater than some specified goal, some specified target that you have for them, then the value that returns back is 0.3. So maybe they get a 30% bonus. But if it's not, if it's less than that, if that logical test is not met and it's not true, then the if function returns no bonus, right? Again, these are just sort of, I know it's hard to see these out of context, but these are ways that you would program the syntax here. Now, coming back to our problem that we faced up here with our second bullet point, you could actually nest if functions inside one another. So you're putting an if and an if. And so in this particular example, we saw is if C5 is less than 0, right? If it's less than 0, if that's true, then that will always be a negative number. Because any number that's less than 0 is going to be a negative number. But if C5 is not less than 0, there are actually two particular states where C5 could be not less than 0. That would be if it was equal to 0 or if it was greater than 0. So we actually nest another if function into our original if function in the location where the false argument needs to be. So what will happen is if C5 is not less than 0, then Excel will move to this if function and we'll say if C5 is equal to 0, we'll call that 0. If not, then it's a positive number. And you notice this way we've handled all three possible states of the number. If it's less than 0, it's negative. If it's equal to 0, our secondary if function will capture that and say that it's 0. And if it's greater than 0, then our secondary if function will capture that as well. And again, we'll get some practice with this with the worksheets that we'll do in a separate video. So that's the basics of an if statement. Now, Excel has other if statements or I should say, can integrate other functions into if statements, other logical operators that may help you fine-tune some of your if statements. You can actually enter in the and, the or the not command, and that will help you understand what's going on with your different logical operators. So the and function is a way to say, I want more than one logical argument to be met in order for this statement to be true or false. So let's say that I want to isolate all my salesmen who've sold more than a dollar amount, more than some target in a specific number of days. Well, that's two logical operators that need to be met. So I would utilize my AND function as part of the logical argument. Or, let's say I want to use the OR function. I want to say, okay, we could either have this or that. Either you met your sales volume target or you sold through a certain amount in a certain number of days. Either one of those, right? Either one of those conditions, I could utilize an OR function for. And it works the same way as an AND operator. You can have this logical argument or that logical argument, right? So you see the third one here is the not logical argument, and that's basically the inverse of what's happening. So a not statement is going to pursue the opposite of what your logical argument is. So if it was not 5 or sales greater than target, then you're trying to find people who have sales that are less than target. It's a little confusing. You won't come across it that often, but these are just some additional functions you can incorporate into your if functions. Now, finally, actually we're going to do a couple more, sorry. We have pre-packaged if functions that do things, that do operations that are very common for a lot of people utilizing Excel spreadsheets. And these are the count functions, the count if or the count ifs. Now, both of these functions are practically the same, and so one just allows a little more flexibility. So you see the COUNTIF function has two arguments that it enters into its syntax. The range, that would be the range of cells that you were looking to count, and then the logical criteria, right? And so it's the idea that for the range, if you selected, let's say, B4, or excuse me, for the range, this would be the range of cells that it will actually count over. And the criteria, if you just put B4, then that's going to select and count anything that's equal to B4. If you were to put, as it states here, greater than 0, it's going to select any values that are greater than 0, and it's going to count that within its range. Now, it's not summing. I want you to be very clear here. It's not summing the value. It's counting the number of cells in that specific range. The COUNTIFs function, which you see here, just gives you additional criteria, right? Criteria for range 1, criteria, so forth and so on. So it's giving you more if statements. We'll utilize some of these as we go along. Now, I'm not bombarding you with if statements, but let's just jam out a few more, and then we can come back and show you how you utilize a lot of these syntax within the actual spreadsheet. So again, these are more if functions that have pre-canned formulas, pre-canned functions within them. So the range, or the average if function is going to take the average, right? It's going to evaluate the average over a specific range of cells if a criteria is met. And you see that it has three arguments. The range, that's the range that you're actually calculating the average over, whatever the logical criteria is. Then this average range, that's the actual cells that you can use to find the average. You'll see how we utilize that differentiation in some of the more spreadsheets as we go along. And so, but it's just like COUNTIF, except it's taking the average. Now, the average ifs function is just like the COUNTIFs function, just gives you more criteria, more if statements. And then the final one we want to mention is the SUMIF formula. This, again, is going to, it's an if statement, but it's going to utilize the summation function. So you select a range of cells that you want to evaluate, you select the logical criteria, and the sum range is, again, what you actually utilize to find the sum, but we'll show you how that's used in a bit. But this is going to sum across any cell that makes the criteria. So this is different from the COUNTIF function, because the COUNTIF function is just counting the cells. The SUMIF function is actually adding up all the values within the cells once they meet a logical criteria. That's a lot of functions, and so I want you to come back to this video as we look at some of the Excel spreadsheet documentation, but hopefully it'll clear stuff up when we actually start utilizing these.